So I'm going to give screen share rights. I'm going to stop sharing so that Ellen can share at will. And then Ellen, I'll be lurking here. Chris and I will be lurking to join in however need be.
All right, sounds good. You can lurk all you want.
Okay.
Let me pull this up and it will just help me stay a little bit on track with some of my thoughts. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk and just kind of want to put out there, I am not an expert, so I'll just tell you a little bit about our experience here in Goldendale and what we're trying to work through. I don't know that we've had anybody show up to board meeting with guns, but I did have to call 911 on a meeting. So those are all new experiences that we've lived through in the last 2+ years. So I started as a superintendent here in Goldendale 3 years ago. So this is my 3rd year in the district. And one of the things that we really started engaging with is how do we move from where we are into where we need to be for our students? So it was primarily a very adult focused system. And so trying to shift that adult focus into a more student focus. As we talked to people, one of the things that became apparent was that we needed to redefine what we thought of as student success. So really looked at what do we currently define as student success, and we were pretty traditional. So it's grades, it's how many accolades do you have from FFA or from athletics, those kinds of pieces. But what the board kept telling me was we see students come back to our community who didn't necessarily have all those pieces in high school, but now they're part of our community, they're business owners, they're functioning very well. And we also see kids that we have defined as successful in our school system who leave and then come back from college not being able to finish because they don't have the skills of perseverance to continue on. So we've really tried to reimagine what those outcomes are. And in doing that, have worked with Joanne McEachen and the Learner First and have been very influential in the work that we've been doing here. Her comment or one of her quotes is that meaning and fulfillment are the new wealth and contribution is the only way that we can get there. So taking from a very individualistic kind of view of success and broadening that. So when our students know that they contribute every day in the classroom, that's very important to us, that they know that they're needed either for their own learning and or for someone else. They have a reason for being there every single day, and they can use that learning for a broader context. So they're learning to use that learning in their classroom community, in their school community, and broader. So how do they take the learning that they're doing and really contribute outside? And then we've also defined what that means, that we have to have self-understanding, connection, knowledge, and competencies in order to really have that idea of contribution. So like all of you in March 2020, we went remote. And what we saw were, we gave our system permission to do things differently. So your kids are not going to be in front of you. So let's do some projects you've always wanted to do. Let's involve our families like we've never done that before. And what we saw were really cool things happening. Videos or like these pictures of our students doing things, and they were very, very proud of the work they were doing. Comments from families of how they really appreciated to have that opportunity hands-on with their kids. So we did that piece of just, really trying to do projects, things that were different within our work, and having a different way of interacting with our students. We also realized technology-wise how far behind we were. We struggled to get one-to-one Chromebooks out. We struggled with connectivity. We had, like it's been talked about today, one teacher using Google Classroom, another using something different. But even within Google Classroom, not having any system that we were using. So knew that we had a lot of learning that we needed to do. So as we moved into the following school year, one of the pieces that we brought forward were family connections. We actually started our year with 3 full days of our teachers meeting one-on-one with a family member and our students. Part of that was so that we could distribute our Chromebooks so that we could get those pieces of those devices out. But the other part really was, how do we connect with those families? So we had the conversation around who are you, what are your hopes, and what are your dreams for your child. That information was collected by the teacher and then used instructionally throughout the year. As we started the year, we didn't really know what we were going to end up with COVID, but we created a model that showed, we could be fully online, we could have small groups in our schools, we could go hybrid or in person, and we actually did all of those throughout the school year. So we started fully remote. By October, we were in hybrid, and then in April, we were able to have every student in every day. So it was good to have that kind of model out there. We also really synthesized the tools that we were using technologically. So Google Classroom and Seesaw were the ones that we were using for different grade levels. Screencastify was a teacher tool, Zoom to make sure that we had that synchronous time with kids, and then the storage piece of the Google Drive. And that really helped us focus in our professional development as we started that school year. Like many of you, we had an extreme case of Zoom fatigue. And what we found was we started having an over-reliance on technology. So as we came into this school year, many of our families said, if my kid is gone due to being quarantined or whatever, we don't want technology. We want that paper back and forth. They were all tired of it. So my concern right now in the system is how far back have we gone in our use of technology, and how do we continue to leverage it forward? We've been able to keep somewhat on track, just again, because of those quarantines, but also just know that that's a piece that we have to continue to keep in the forefront. We were also kind of in a survival mode, and we reverted back to those digital worksheet kinds of pieces. So rather than going out and continuing the work that really engaged our students with the projects, we sort of reverted back. And I think it's just a very human thing. We can only tolerate so much. So in the spring last year, as we were bringing all of our students in, we did lesson design based on one specific student. So a teacher would interview a student in their classroom and then redesign that lesson that there was coming up for that specific student. And it doesn't sound like it has a huge impact, but there really is a power in one. So a lot of times we tell our teachers, do this for everyone, and then nothing happens because they're trying to do it for everyone. And so nothing actually changes. By having them really focus in on that one student, they made the changes that were needed, and they really they saw the difference that it made, not only for that student, but for many others. So when we have that issue of, one student is having this need, it may not just be that student. So by changing our instruction, we really were able to see that greater impact across the board. So this school year, we've worked on connection, really trying to help our teachers work towards connecting with our students. Does the student have a connection with their learning? Do they feel connected with school? I don't know about you all, but we had the TikTok thing happening at the beginning of the school year. And as we started to think about our students and why would they, suddenly just go out and damage a bathroom because TikTok said they should, what we realized was our 7th graders had not had a full year of school since they were in 4th grade. And so they really had no connection to that facility, that building that they were in. And so how do we create that for our students became a real big piece of what we were doing. So that connection, are they connected with their peers? Again, we've seen a social emotional lag of our students. Our high school principal talks about how teachers are, that conversation with them of the 9th graders feel more like 7th graders to them, somewhere in their 7th grade year. And when you think again about what's happened in our buildings and across our society, that's not going to be unusual. I think to a certain extent, our adults are also figuring that out. So some of their emotional development stopped about 1.5 to 2 years ago. So really trying to understand what it means to be connected. Again, really personalizing that learning and trying to keep the humans in the forefront. Along the way, what we have seen, and you've probably seen this in other formats, but we had this disaster and we hit the disillusionment phase, and now we're trying to swing back up. What we saw in the first year was a lot more tolerance. This year, a lot less tolerance on everything that we were needing to do. So that's a piece of what we've looked at. And as I looked at this graph, I kept thinking, so what well, how come it's taking us so long to get out of that disillusionment phase? And one of the things that I found was this graphic, which shows that there are secondary impacts. And I think that in our state, in Washington, masks were removed last summer. Having to put them back on became a huge issue as we were moving into this school year. So really having to pull out of that disillusionment phase, and how do we focus in on those things that make us passionate about learning on a day-to-day basis. And that lesson design, again, with that student in mind, is what we have found as part of that leverage of really looking at how do we really shift that thinking? How do we look at our students as human beings? How do we ensure that they have those connections and that self-understanding to be effective, not only in their learning in the classroom, but as they go beyond? So what we are really still having to wrap our heads around is well-being, the well-being of our staff. What I know is that you can't give what you don't have. It sounds cliche, but it's just so ultimately true. If you have run out of all of your patients, you have no more to give to that student. So how do we pay attention to our staff? How do we create that environment of trust within our system? And we have evidence that we're doing that. We have evidence that our teachers are feeling like they can experiment with new things, that they can try, that they can slow down and really pay attention to the learners in front of them. But it's still outside of that, how do we make sure that our staff have the capacity to continue giving to our students? Our students are still growing their skills. So how do we continue to really look at and take that time that says, you know, you need to really understand who you are in order to connect to each other, in order to connect to your content, in order to be able to contribute. And then what we're also seeing in that well-being framework is just expectations, both met and unmet, with our families and community. One of the things in the model that has been shown today that I still try to wrap my head around is our families expect us to be here for their kids at least 6.5 hours a day. So how do we keep that functioning within our system while we're trying to innovate and move beyond? I am a parent, a grandparent, and what I see in my children who are in their 30-ish area is that they have gone for remote jobs. They've gone for high-paying technology jobs. And when I look at our teachers who have a similar level of education, we don't have that capacity. So again, the model that's being shared today is intriguing to me of, can we look at it in terms of maybe a medical model of compensation? So you have a doctor who sees many people, a physician's assistant type, with a different pay structure, so that we can really start compensating our master teachers in a different way, as well as really shifting how are we personalizing that learning so that our kids are engaged, while paying attention to the well-rounded human beings that we know we want in society. So that was a lot of talking. Leilani, do you have questions?
Let me get myself unmuted here. Yes. You know, I'm hearing something so similar. So first I want to go to the emotional side, right? I love that you're paying attention to that so much, Ellen. That's a true leader. So compliments to you.
Thank you. It's very opposite of where I've been. I mean, if you saw any people from the beginning of my career, they would go, what? She's talking about relationships? Because I was the person pushing the data and the pacing guide. So, yeah. Yeah,
you're more oriented to function. But people in your position all over the country are getting sometimes pulled into this social emotional side stuff, kicking and screaming, but you just kind of went in there, and that's really good. That's a positive thing about you. And I'm seeing it in the data. Like our national survey definitely showed this is an issue, not just with the data itself, but the comments. Because, you know, every question we asked had 56 comments on there or more, right? And just reading through some of them you wouldn't want on prime time that came from the teachers. Trust me. Wouldn't, I mean, if the superintendent knew the teacher wrote that in my national survey, you know,
those are the ones you synthesize for us, and then we can glean from them.
Yeah. So that's a really positive thing. But, you know, the other thing my mind goes to is like, and you say you're interested in this new model, this hybrid logistics thing that's on the horizon, right? When you want to care about people, you want to take stuff off them. And part of that, just from raising children and, trying to get kids to learn in school is you got to discipline them, right? So I think we're also headed really heavily into this age of discipline to get teachers to not do what's hard work for them that they don't see because they've been doing it all their lives. Like ever since they became a teacher, this is the way I do it. Okay, well, I don't want you to do that anymore because I want you to use this because then I'm freeing you up. I know you don't believe me right now. I'm freeing you up to do what you really want to do, which is less lecturing and it's the whole lecture versus nurture conversation. So back to the social emotional part, the experience of the child, your focus on contribution and collaboration and blah, 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 blah. That's the future. It's what a good brand does. So you're all in on the right direction. Kind of what are you struggling with the most? Can you sort of like, it's probably all over the bit. You're probably going to give me a list of 50 things, right? So just you go. Right?
So it depends on the day, right? So, yeah. I mean, today started with so many absences that, I've got a principal working in one school in the classroom. I've got everybody pulled from our teachers on special assignment to, all those people are filling up other openings. So that's one struggle. We have tried that conversation. What can you stop doing? And it's not a one and done conversation. So I think it's giving people permission to think and then coming back around and saying, have you tried not doing that? And then coming back in again and saying, what are other things that we can not do and do that collectively. It's trying to honor teachers' creativity. So one of the things I've seen across my career is we went through the era where if you just read the script, you're a good teacher. And I don't believe it ever was, but that was what we told people. And now we're trying to shift into, you really have to think differently. You have to be able to create. You have to be responsive to your students. So that's another piece that I think will be a push or a different move as we're continuing forward. And then I guess I expressed a little bit on the compensation side. So in that model, as I'm thinking about it, we have to start compensating our teachers differently. Money doesn't change the world, but it does have an impact on how we're going to be able to retain people in education. So I don't know, those are some kind of big ideas that are on my head today. We're shifting technology directors and we had a resignation. And so I'm hearing a lot of things today of how I can pull this new person in and get them started in education technology just differently from where we've been in the past.
Yeah. It's definitely, it's a seat at the table now. It's not like a guy down in the basement with no window in his office, right?
Unfortunately, that you just described where we have the person.
I always tell people that I'm like, the curriculum people rule the roost. They're like the big man on campus, and the tech guys often, they often have been treated like, it's the tech guy, right? Tech is it needs to drive, right? Almost everything now. And for top of mind for you. So a lot of things that you just said are really interesting because I think.
Well, I wanted to just jump in and really thank you, Ellen, for giving some of the points of the teachers, because that was on my mind is really what's the response you're getting from the teachers? Is this, just one more thing. I know you think I can do it differently, better, but, and again, the intriguing to me is I'm constantly in my world trying to get teachers to see technology as not an add-on, but a change, a shift. And it's happening in certain areas, but not in some areas. I'm more familiar with the math science. And as you know, changing math and science, it seems like it should go so easily towards technology, but it doesn't. So I just wanted more input on how you have facilitated. It's not an add-on.
Yeah, thank you, Patricia, for that. That was really eloquently said. Yeah, it's what's happening now with you, Ellen, is you're having to lead by first laying the groundwork of let's think about your job. What are you doing? And if you just get people to do that, and then you start leading up the hill, right? Like that's a huge thing. It really is. For someone to just say, I'm going to remake my everything the way I did it. It does what I call shaking your stable datums. It's like mentally you've laid stakes in the ground and like, here's your little zone of control. Giving up your zone of control is scary for everyone. And changing my daily routine. Do you mean I'm going to drink my coffee later or what's happening? It's scary, So talk a little bit more about that. Like, you don't have to say names, but what do you see happening with your people?
So I expressed a little of that, of what I feel is a little bit of backslide between last year and this year. So we had some good quality pieces of Google Classroom. So we had a standardized way for teachers to make their Google Classroom and use that. And it was just part of what was being done. And we haven't continued that. So I have some concerns about how do we kind of move back into that, or is that necessary? Is that really where we want to go? So that's a question point as well. I do my best to listen to the system. So, getting that feedback of, where are we, not pushing on those days where we're at a breaking point, but also have some systems in place. So we have some change teams, was what we call our district and building teams, and using them and the leadership within those to continue the work. Trying to pull back from that idea of technology as a babysitter and into how do we leverage technology in a way that really enhances learning. So that's another piece of it. So I don't know that I have specific great success stories. It just is trying to keep things moving within the system and continuing those conversations and following up. So when we say we're going to do something, keeping that moving. Yes, we're going to do this. We agreed to do this, and then measuring how is the impact for the student. So what we don't want is a huge lift for a teacher that has a minuscule impact for our students. We want to be able to have that huge lift for a teacher that has a huge lift for our students.
Yeah. What's your payback for that?
Ellen, again, how large is your district? How large is your area?
So we have a little over 850 students, 3 buildings. So elementary, middle, and high school.
Okay. When you're getting more, do you feel like more traction with the elementary or with change?
In other districts, I've always been able to move the younger grades faster. They seem to be able to do that, and not necessarily. So I would say across the board, we have pockets right now where people are really saying, okay, I get this, I'm moving. But I think holistically across our system, what we've been able to do is create a sense of trust where people are able to innovate, not having to ask permission for it, but just able to know that's what we're doing. That's what we're trying to support.
Thank you. I don't mean to be rude and not to show my face, but I also just was curious too. Again, we are strong into Google Docs. That was a big push 2 years ago and took a lot of change for the teachers in the area to get into Google Docs. How do you see it integrating with that? And I know you said you're kind of on the fence about that shift from that.
So the Google Classroom has a lot of pieces that are very beneficial, and the whole Google system allows you to have your documents stored in the same place. All those kinds of pieces are very intertwined. My understanding right now is that there are some security issues with Google that the cyber tech people are concerned about. So not sure how that's going to go, but also don't want to whole scale, now that we've got everybody using Google Drive, shift to something different. Because my thinking is storage, right? So I can figure out where to share. I can do it on OneDrive. I can do it on Google Drive. I can do it on my desktop, and that doesn't throw me. But many people don't see things that way. They see Google Docs as something different from a Word document, from a rich text document, or whatever. So that's just different people learn differently that way.
Yeah.
For the end.
Go
ahead,
ahead.
Patricia.
For the individual teacher, I know that shift. Once they've learned, oh, well, I can put this in Google Docs and go back to it if I have to remorph it to a different one. Although I know there's so many commonalities between that. But again, our teachers had also gotten used to kind of Canvas, which is at the upper level, at the college levels, and that shift too, for me being in transition, having the Google compared to the Canvas type is something that teachers are resistant to change.
Yeah. So
Ellen, one of the things that I picked up as I was listening that I felt was remarkable. You gave permission to risk, and that's huge because that's always a fear, right? And so, like, for you to create a risk-taking culture, that's huge, right? That's gigantic. And I've seen successes in that in other systems where they started with that, and somebody in the room, the superintendent usually stood up and said, you know what, we're going to be taking risks. And guess what? You're not going to get poked at about it. You have full permission to take risks. And in fact, if you're not taking risks, that's when somebody's going to come and talk to you. And that creates such a magical moment because it takes the burden off. You're like, oh, okay, great. Now I can be creative. Fantastic. I can be a problem solver. I can be a forward thinker. That's awesome. I was also curious about your evidence of growth. You had mentioned some growth and forward movement, and I was curious to know more about that and how you were sort of seeing and measuring.
So one of the good things about there aren't good things about pandemics, but one of the things we leveraged was there's no state testing, right? So we didn't have state testing last year. Or the year before. So that was part of our reasoning of take a risk. There's not that thing hanging over your head. So let's move. So we don't have that piece. We have some internal rubrics that we're using. So ability to look at some very rich text of, where are we on this? So that's a piece. We've also engaged with some outside agencies who have come in and taken that look and listened to our staff and been able to say, well, yes, top to bottom, what we're hearing is trust within your system. Top to bottom, what we're hearing is that idea that you are fine to do something different, and it's actually encouraged, and you are that we want people to slow down the content push and really look at, who are the humans in front of us. So that's another piece. The actual student data is much more difficult right now for us.
Yeah. So I always like the attitude too, like you've led, by letting people start to think about their role. But then I'm going to harken back to something Patricia just said, and that is, you've also allowed a sense of order to come in, at least with what Chris and I said. It's like the digital document world, right? I guess what I would also say is that, the next level is the not just letting, but the real hard leading, where you take away some of that very disaggregated down to the minuscule nth degree piece of content that is scattered and individually teacher led, and start putting in place courseware. And that's the scary part, right? But that is where you see the most majestic lift in terms of reducing your teacher burden. And it's hard, but until you get them in there, until you like tap someone on the shoulder and say, I'm asking you to pilot this, you're going to be the pilot, right? And you start sort of doing sort of skirmish warfare on that. You can't, as a superintendent, the big districts can't, maybe you could, right? Like the really big ones with like 70,000 kids and umpteen teachers, they can't mandate anything, right? They don't dare, because they'll have insurrections and union people calling them. It's going to be ugly. But when you're a close-knit family group, you can kind of start to do that. Or you got a teacher leader that's so totally groovy, you can bring in the alternate universe of courseware, which is in the direction of laying down your railroad tracks of everything, right? Which is the biggest, what I would say is the biggest differentiator going into the future. So that means every step, every activity, the lesson plans are written. And when lesson plan 1 ends, number 2 begins, right? And that gives you that personalized pathway across which now, because it's laid, you can shift time and space and how you use your human resources. You can level up your masterclass teachers to a better salary and put in some paraprofessionals. The whole world can change, but it starts with laying down the railroad tracks, and those tracks are not laid with discrete content. Unless you've actually done in your LMS, step 1, step 2, step, like it's all written, right? That would be, you could still use docs that way, right? In some video, but it's going to be a little not as fun, right? But so what are your thoughts about that? Because I think you're headed into those wins is my thinking. And then you're not the only one. I think everybody is, but what are your thoughts?
So I don't think I know enough. That's my first thought. As I think about what I know about learning, there are discrete skills, which are more easily this, then this, then this, then this comes more easily with those discrete skills. So as we get more complex in the type of learning we want, then I'm curious about how that looks in that train track as you describe it. So that's a piece that I still need to see. Most of what we experience with tutorial type programs is just that, they're tutorial. You could have that piece of paper with the same activity on it, or you could have that something different. So where are those pieces, those resources that are more dynamic and do pay attention to, yes, you need to be able to have a one-to-one correspondence in your counting, but you also need to be able to understand that quantity piece. So where are those activities that kind of go back and forth in those levels of learning? I'm quite passionate about we have to have that low level of learning in order to get to the higher levels of learning, or to deepen the levels of learning, however we want to describe that. But we can't just be satisfied with just those pieces. And I hearken to some of what I feel we're seeing in our communities is because possibly of that No Child Left Behind test mantra, right? So if you do well on the test, then you're an educated individual. But what we didn't teach people for that period of time was, how do you have a discussion with another human being in a respectful way and be able to disagree at the end of it? So that's the other piece that I want to make sure that we're leading towards as we look at where is that train track.
Yeah, and that's yeah. So you are in the, based on your presentation and everything you just said, you're in the conversation of content, but you're also in the middle of the space and time problem. And it's funny that you say that, because Chris, didn't we just hear in Phoenix that that assistant super that was in the room that was from Phoenix Union High School? He said the same thing. He said, I don't know how we differentiate between the real problem we're in the middle of that we don't clearly identify, which is time and space, from the content. And I'm like, you're in next year. That's what we're going to talk about next year. Please don't go there yet. Right? But you're already there too, Ellen. But Chris, didn't that happen? Like, wasn't he like, he was all over that?
Yeah, totally. And it's valid, right? And I think it sort of points out sort of the amorphous nature of this change that we're in the middle of, right? And because you can't think of, right, we talked about systems thinking, you can't think of one thing without addressing some of the others. And yes, we should be explicit in our planning and our forward movement, but that doesn't mean that we're not thinking about these other things that are running alongside of us, because if we don't think about them until we get to that spot, then it's going to be too late. Then we're going to be behind the 8 ball on the thing. And maybe some of the things that we did now are going to have impact on the success of this other thing further on down the track. And that's just that's the glory and art of our job, right? It's just what we do. It's education. It's just that complex. But yeah, that's not unique. Everybody, there's a lot of folks in that spot.
Yeah. Yeah, I love the work that Ellen's been doing, though, and what I'd like to do for the last couple of minutes, I have you for this particular part, and then we're going to do hybrid logistics, right? And then we're going to have you back on the panel. I'm going to ask you other questions then. But for right now, what I'm thinking is, there's been a lot of things you did right, like a lot of superintendents did a lot of things right, and let's just count your blessings for right now, like. Can you just kind of go through those, like the things that you're grateful for?
Yeah, there are a lot of things I'm grateful for. I'm grateful for our staff and their dedication to the students and the families. I'm grateful that they're willing to do a few things here and there differently to try it out. I'm grateful for our students and how they challenge us every single day because that's how we learn and that's how we grow. I am very fortunate. I have a good school board. They have stood with us through this, so that even though things aren't ideal everywhere, that also is very important in order to do the work that we're doing. So those are all things I'm grateful for. I have had the luxury of partnering with some very good people in education, both inside the district and external to the district. And again, they are the people that continue to challenge me and to say yes and. So I don't just stop. I think it's my mindset, or what I try to keep in my mindset, is if I'm not happy with where things are, what do I need to learn in order to do something different? And I'm grateful that I have other people around me who are continuing that work as well.
It's really awesome. And then I also want to say, let's go back to your point about when students feel that they're needed as contributors, makes all the difference in the world, right? Mm-hmm. And I have to tell you, when you said that, I was like, I almost cried. I didn't have my camera on, which was good. Because I don't know if all of you guys that are on the line right now and pipe up and say what you want to say about this too, but like when I went to school, nobody was caring about that. No. Like that's a long time ago, but you were just supposed to show up and take what you got, right? And those days are long gone. So to my mind, some superintendent who's even leading that somewhere in the country is like, kids want to be here because they know they got to contribute that day. They're part of the group. They got to like chime in. They're expected to. And if they don't, they're like, why aren't you talking? Right? Like, what's happening with you? Like that. Wow. Like no one ever did that with me when I was young. I'm telling you, like I was already vocal, as you can probably tell. So nobody really needed to with me, but it would have been a miracle if that happened. So let's just say that that's a beautiful thing. Like, because wasn't happening when we were young. And tell me if I'm wrong, you guys, right? Like, but I know you all, not all of you are like super young bucks. So that's powerful, Ellen. And I'm sure you've seen it, like the power of it.
Yeah. It does. It makes a huge difference. For some students who have had a lot of trauma in their lives, and when they know that somebody is caring about them coming tomorrow and they're expected to learn in order to continue to contribute back. It's life-changing.
Yeah, that's life-changing. That's like huge. And Chris and I were working together already with him in the Edu Jedi when we were talking about the end stage of the whole game, through the logistical change, is becoming a focused expo center of learning, we called it, experiential center. Like now, education it gets a different sort of meaning to the definition of the word. It's the definition is my experience. Like it's beyond, I got learning dumped in my head. I can tell you I had an experience with something. Yeah. So you're leading in that particular, and that's really great. Chris, did you want to make a comment on that?
No, I think it's fantastic as well. I big applause to you, Ellen, because you're leading the work and you're providing an example for the rest of us. And what I think about when I listen is two things. One of those is learner identity, and the other one is student agency. And those things are sort of inextricably connected. And especially when you're working with kids who are coming from trauma, and any kid, right? I mean, any kid, even if they have a ton of support, can have a damaged learner identity. And what that does is that it doesn't allow them to exercise agency. And so in a system that you're describing, you've placed that as a priority and are beginning to support learner identity, which then will cause them to be able to exercise agency. And that's awesome. And that does change lives. And what I see in some systems is that they've extended that to adults, because some of us adults have a damaged learner identity, and we don't exercise agency, and that's sad. But in a risk-taking culture that has built trust, you can help to address that. And so high five to you guys for doing that stuff.
Yeah. And I want to say one other thing about your brand. I believe the future is, what is your brand on the internet? And if you just shared, because it's so interesting what different superintendents share with us, right? If you started sharing publicly that your brand is student contribution, right? Like, we're a contributor place. I think that's a beautiful thing. I think as a parent, if I lived in your district and I had kids, I'd be like, I'm all over that, right? Like, I'd be all in. So I would actually put that on your brand board. What would you say to that?
I would say eventually that's what I hope to do. What I am trying to do right now is get that language built within the system. Because I think that if we brand it too soon, then it becomes one more thing. And,
that's true.
So that's kind of where I've been working along that line. Of just, I want to be able to have not everyone, the system be able to talk about what does contribution mean and how are we doing that before we start labeling ourselves.
Yeah, I understand. Well, it's exciting to have you with us. Well, Elllen, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been fun conversation. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.